Thank you so much for joining us today, Gary.
Pleasure.
Oh, I just loved your book. I couldn't put it down. It was such a great read. It was so interesting. For those readers or listeners who aren't familiar with your book, The Psychic Tests, An Adventure in the World of Believers and Skeptics, can you tell us what it's about?
Sure. I think it's the first book ever to talk to believers and skeptics equally. And the premise of the book is whether you believe in them or not, psychics are likely to have an impact on who will date you, who will trust you, who will hire you, and even who will fire you. And that's because people with lots of power and responsibility, like chief executives and world leaders, and even police murder investigators, are hiring psychics and taking them very seriously.
Mm.
So there's some of the stories that I tell in the book.
So, why did you want to write this book? What triggered this interest in spending 2 years of your life researching and writing this book?
It was a surprise to me actually that I landed on this subject for my debut book, but two reasons: one's personal and one's professional. The personal reason is my sister, my younger sister Taryn. So Taryn has always been obsessed with psychics, and I used to really poke fun at her about this because my sister in the book is the voice of the believer, and I in the book am the voice of the skeptic. And at least that's where we start in the book.
Yes.
And during the journey of the book, we step into each other's worlds a little bit. But before that, before I started writing the book, my sister had dragged me along to see these psychics, and um, I'd never taken them very seriously. Always thought it was just a bit of entertainment and a bit of sibling kind of bonding and banter. And that grew a lot darker in 2015 when our dad died suddenly. And then my sister sought out the services of 10 different mediums to obsessively try and bring my dad back into the room. And when she was doing that, I grew concerned that her vulnerability and her grief were being exploited, and that she was being suspended in the bargaining or denial phase of grief. So that was the personal. The professional was when, as a journalist for the Sydney Morning Herald, I reported on a story which staggered me. It was the executive chairman of Australia's biggest stockbroking firm called BBY, and his name is Glenn Rosewall. And Glenn had hired a psychic called Naveen Rottinger and paid her for 4 years to advise him on where to invest the company's stocks and shares, so millions of dollars, and also who to hire and even who to fire. So the spirits would advise Naveen on who wasn't going to perform well in the next month, and Glenn would find a way of firing them. He ran the stockbroking firm this way for 4 years, and after which time it went bust. $61 million owed to clients. And there was a liquidator's report, and the psychic Naveen was brought in as a witness. And suddenly I had this new hunch because previously my sister had made me believe that the people that sought out psychics to help them make decisions about their lives were perhaps gullible or fragile and naive and vulnerable. When I reported on that story about Glenn, it made me wonder whether he was an outlier or whether there were people like him who were very powerful, responsible for millions of dollars and dozens of staff, and authoritative, who sought out psychics' advice and took them very seriously. So
Mm.
that's where that was the impetus for writing the book and where I started.
And it's absolutely fascinating, isn't it? I mean, and also fun fact for listeners, which you include in the book, Glenn Rosewall, the CEO, is actually the son of tennis great Ken Rosewall. And in your research, you found that some major names, apart from, presidents of the United States and associated family members, but also famously Christine Holgate,
Yeah.
who the former CEO of Blackmore's, who subsequently went on to head Australia Post and then was embroiled in the Cartier watch scandal. You tell this great story. You have to read the book, everyone. You tell this great story of her involvement in fortune tellers, which she speaks about publicly. She has spoken about publicly. So here's the thing, though. This sparked your interest, but there's a difference between your interest being sparked and then deciding to write a whole book. So what was because you can, go down an internet rabbit hole and research this kind of stuff. What made you decide there's a book in this?
Yeah. Well, first of all, the gravity of that decision that Glenn took, because when that stockbroking firm went bust, it was the biggest stockbroking firm collapse since the global financial crisis. So that's no small thing. So, they've brought down this stockbroking firm, and I think because as a journalist, you go into every feature and piece that you write, knowing that the purpose of journalism sometimes is to hold power to account, and especially weed out places where power is under investigated and could be used in nefarious ways or leading to corruption and those kind of things. So it suddenly occurred to me, and I started to do a bit of research and realised that there are US presidents like Ronald Reagan, and there are chief execs like Christine Holgate, as you mentioned, who, by the way, attributes her psychic interactions with the success that she's had in her career. So the complete polar opposite story to Glenn, and it started to, and I started to think about faith and connection and power. I started to think about people of faith and about the to a secular person, the supernatural miracles which they believe in, and how we treat them very differently, and we give them a lot more respect than the believers of psychics, who to the mind of a secular person believe in equally supernatural miracles which seem unfeasible and unproven by science. And yet with one cohort, we in Britain, half the book set in Britain, so for a long time in Britain we gave people of faith seats in the House of Lords. In Australia, we give them tax breaks to run huge influential organisations and a say over public policy. Whereas with psychics and their believers, we do what I did with my sister. We deride them and we mock them, and we don't take them very seriously. So I think the journalist in me wanted to explore in a really rigorous way this form of power that they have that is wholly under investigated and wholly unchecked and unregulated as well, and to find out whether that power was being used for good or ill. And also, I think I really wanted to write a book that no one, on a subject that no one was talking about, because there are so many, as a gay writer, like, I feel like there's so many great coming out memoir type stories, and those stories are always really engaging and really, really important. There's loads of books about the really huge subjects of our time, like climate change. What I wanted to do was to come in and write a book from a fresh perspective that talked to believers and skeptics equally, which was really difficult, by the way.
Yes.
To kind of like play into the wider themes of the post-truth world that we're living in, the dangers of conspiracy and misinformation, which became like even more pertinent because COVID happened. I started writing the book before COVID, and it happened during the writing of the book, and the book kind of evolved with COVID, and that becomes part of the story later. And it's just a fascinating subject. There's not one person that I have spoken to who hasn't lent into this story, because I think some skeptics go, oh God, that's all a load of bullshit and I don't believe in any of it, which was the original title of my book, by the way. The working title was Bullshit ?
Oh.
And my publisher said we didn't want to alienate believers too much. But yeah, I think that some skeptics initially go, well, I don't want to read about that. And then you tell them about the very, very powerful people who have an impact over their lives, their managers, their prime ministers, the police force that their taxes are paying money towards, and you go, they have a big sway within those realms. And then suddenly they lean in and they are fascinated.
I think that you've done an incredible job treading that line between, believer and skeptic, and it is written. Even though you say that you're a skeptic, the way it is written is very objective. Now, when you start writing a book about this space, it's called the psychic tests, and it's the psychic realm is extremely broad. How how did you think? Did you think at the start how you were going to structure it or what you were going to research? Or did you kind of just start and see what happened?
Good question. I did have to set the parameters because this world is huge, and
Mm,
I was very aware that I think at one point in the book I say this is all very Western. And I was very aware that I was mainly focused on England and Australia and a bit of America. And America is a whole different ball game too, because belief there is such a big part of their society. If you were running as a president and you claimed that you were an atheist in America, you probably wouldn't get voted in, and that's sort of accepted there.
yeah.
So that's sort of that level of faith and belief um, transports over to psychic belief in America. So it was almost like that's its own book. So because I'm British and I've lived in Australia for 10 years, and at the time when I started writing the book, I was living in London. I kind of split my time between London and Sydney outside of COVID. So it made sense just to focus on those two countries. So that was the first parameter. Then it was kind of like, where do I set where is neutral ground? Like because to a skeptic, neutral ground is skepticism, but to a believer, it's an open mind. So that's when my publisher and I came up with the idea of having my sister throughout the book. So she pulls my head in when my kind of skeptical, curious, questioning, sardonic, cynical side rises up and says, "Well, to a believer, this is how we would approach that." So she pulls my head in that way. And then when it comes down to just the psychic world, as you say, which is huge, I went down to the Mind Body Spirit Festival in both Sydney and London, and just discovered just how vast and that was when I really knew that there was a book in this, because for any storyteller, the amount of idiosyncratic and eccentric, quirky people, but also the highly emotional and vulnerable and emotionally charged interactions that world encompasses. I wanted to write a story that just focused on the humanity within that world, and that's why it's called the psychic tests. Each chapter is a different test because we've just fixated on this one test. Is it true? Can people speak to the dead or see into the future? And in effect, do supernatural miracles occur? Which is, we knew that, we'd know whether a God existed or not. And I thought that question has been obsessed over for millennia, from Richard Dawkins and the God delusion to the believer side. And I think that's the least interesting question. And the more interesting question to me was like, within this world, when people are interacting with it, can psychics help with depression, loneliness, vulnerability, grief, imposter syndrome, confidence, all those things? So I wanted to write a John Ronson-esque journey through that world. And I did. You're right. The world is so big that I did have to set some parameters. So I focused mainly on mediums, psychics, and astrologers. So a medium can speak to the dead. A psychic purports to be able to see into the future. Astrology is slightly different, but because of the way that people really do live their lives quite seriously by what their star signs may or may not say, as I show in the book, with some fascinating examples. Like the one I was just talking about was with my friend who's just started my book, was the mother who is actually a friend of mine. She had a cesarean because she didn't want her son to be the same star sign as his dad. So she had a cesarean so she'd have him earlier. And those kind of massive decisions that I always thought that people just thought of star signs like I did as a bit of fun. But I started to realise that people take them very, very seriously. So they were the three main ones that I focused on. And I guess the things that I didn't focus on were you could go into numerology and Reiki and all of those other kind of offshoots of psychics. But I chose to just focus on the three main areas where I saw power and But yeah, I think there's another book in all of the other areas, because there are some people that, I mean, one of the areas that I did kind of zoom into, which I probably wouldn't have done otherwise, were people that call themselves medical intuitives. And that happened when COVID arrived, and I went to the Mind Body Spirit Festival in Sydney, and there was a woman that ran a packed seminar there who stood up in front of all of these people and said, I can create the perfect DNA for you that will protect you from coronavirus. And I just thought, oh my God, these people believed her. So I was thinking, maybe these people will leave that room thinking, at that point we didn't have the vaccine, but maybe they would think they wouldn't need to wash their hands or wear masks, or all of the other precautions that we take, because they genuinely believe that this woman, all you had to do was pay $900, by the way, to go on her retreat. So, that was something that made me think, God, that there is real potential for harm in this world, and it's underreported. And I wanted to, as much as I wanted to not laugh anymore and be dismissive of believers, I also wanted to show the potential for harm in this world, and not to be too blinkered by that.
Mm. And I just also want to mention to listeners that you do that. You do show that that can occur, but you also tell many stories where the psychics are spot on. So it's a really, really good balance. Now, you did a series of it's called the psychic tests. So you did a series of tests, and in the chapters, they're called things like the business test, the politics test, the grief test, the charlatan test, and so on. Did you decide at the start the kinds of tests you wanted to do and then research it that way? Or did you just plunge headfirst, get as much experience as you can, and then group them, cluster them into the tests?
Definitely the latter. I plunged. And in fact, it wasn't structured that way. This is the joy of working with a publisher who's really smart, my publisher, Pantera. I worked with some super smart people there who, ironically, were very intuitive, but I think of that as but they were very intuitive. They almost knew what I was trying to articulate before I could fully form and articulate an idea myself. And that's the real joy of writing a book, because it can be a real solitary experience until you have got the first draft down. So yeah, I absolutely plunged in. It wasn't even called it was called the psychic test with singular. And then my publisher came up with the idea of, like, what if each chapter was a different test? And you've got all of it was just so clear to them that there were all these different tests. And then it was just this amazing epiphany that they had. And I don't think I would have come up with that on my own. So it really is like teamwork, writing a book. And I really loved that level of, once you sort of splurged out the first draft, that restructuring process. I mean, it's so difficult and so time consuming, and it was painful, but it was perfect. It was absolutely perfect. And when they suggested that as the new title, suddenly everything started to fall into place, and even all my key messages around that. And it was kind of what I've been trying to say anyway, but it was a much more tidy way of saying it.
So because you not only spoke to heaps of people, just like in normal conversation, just to get their experiences with psychics, if any, just like your mates or people that you meet in pubs and stuff like that, but you also did heavy duty research. You experienced things for yourself. You did a lot of actual research. How did you physically collate all of these things, like, random conversations versus heavy duty research? Was it a Word document? Like, what was it on a practical level?
From the gonzo research I did, which is when I actually physically went along to see dozens of palm readers, tarot readers, psychics, mediums, medical intuitives, etc. Part of that is the Maya Angelou quote that you never forget how people make you feel. You just don't forget that. You just don't forget how you felt in that moment. And for me, when I stopped going along, like I did with my sister, as this kind of hard-headed skeptic and ready to be dismissive and to mock it all, I started to really, what I did was I suspended my disbelief, and I indulged the small cognitive dissonance that lives within inside me and inside many of us. That's that kind of like, what if? you know. And I think I say in the book, you know, I I used to be an atheist, and I've moved to agnostic. Not that anyone really cares, but for me that was a significant shift, because I don't I don't think God exists, and I don't personally believe God exists, but I don't know He doesn't. And so that really shaped the way that I approach this world and my research, because with the same is true of psychics. I don't believe that they are seeing into the future or speaking to the dead, but I don't know that they're not. So I would go along and obviously would just record. I'd ask for permission to record those on my phone, and they all say yes to that. But then you find yourself, like I was in London in the middle of Leicester Square, and it was frenetic, and there was noise everywhere, people everywhere, sirens, horns hooting on the road. And then I went to see this tarot reader called Merlin Trotter, and that's just an unforgettable experience, because he's on this rudimentary picnic table that he set up, and he is telling you about your future, in the middle of one of the busiest squares in the world. And he, in that moment, because I've chosen to suspend my disbelief, you know, he is nourishing my ego, listening to my anxieties, hearing my dreams, and repeating them back to me in a way that, you know, you transpose your own narrative onto what he's saying. So those kind of things as research were just so memorable, and the experience is just so seductive that that it's you can hear it now. It's as fresh in my head as it was the day that I went to do it in 2019. With the rest of the research, especially with the people, what happened was, when people, friends and friends of friends, discovered that I was writing on this subject, usually they'd say, Gary, I lost my younger sister when I was 15 years old. I've never told you because it's really painful. And this would be, you know, a friend of a friend, so not a particularly close friend, someone who I'd maybe met 4 or 5 times. And I went to see this medium, and the medium said these things, and it really helped me process my grief and my feelings about it. And suddenly, the connection that I had with that person, that I'd only met maybe 4 times, was so profound and poignant after that moment, that it was such a privilege to be trusted with that very emotional story, that yes, I would go away and make notes, and of course I would ask for permission to use their story in the book, and you know, most of them said yes, and a lot of them had pseudonyms. But it gave me it meant I listened to their story, and I heard it in a different way than previously, because previously I would worn my identity as a skeptic so strongly that I sometimes closed down those conversations and gone, well, I don't believe in any of that. It's all ridiculous. It's all pseudoscience. And when you stop doing that, because me saying that to that person isn't going to change their belief, it's real for them. So when I started to do that, I just started to observe and listen in a different way, and I think that research just sits here in your cranium as well. But yeah, I did have to keep track of like who'd said what did, and also the predictions. So like when a psychic made all these predictions, I'd have to listen back to them quite a few times to sort of, if I'm really going to like be fair and test them rigorously, did any of those predictions come true? So I remember sitting with my sister quite a lot, but the interesting thing happens then, because my sister will go, "Well, that came true, that was true," and it's so vague and ambiguous that I'm like, yeah, you're writing in some things there that I think you want it to be true, you know. So
Yes.
interesting psychological human things happen when you go back over your research in that way.
So did you do all the research, or, you know, a huge amount of research to a point and then start writing, or were you writing as you were researching?
I was writing as I was researching, because
Ah,
sometimes, yeah, because sometimes something would happen and I would need to capture it there and then. Like I went to a séance where they tried to bring in the spirit of Margaret Thatcher to tell Britain what to do about Brexit. And in some of those instances, like for example, I did a story for Vice, and that happened before the book. And so, because I'd done that story for the Sydney Morning Herald about the stockbroking firm executive chairman, and then I'd done a story for Vice about the Margaret Thatcher seance. But other times, when I hadn't already done some journalism that led up to the book, it would be kind of like capturing the moment and writing a para, even though it wasn't sat within a structure of a chapter or anything like that. It would just be like, I need to get these details down. I need to not forget those details. It would be the details that, rather than how it made me personally feel, it would be something bonkers that someone would have said that had really struck me and that I needed to capture in that moment. So, and then it was a case of just slotting it in like a jigsaw. But also because half the book's set in Britain and in London, and half the book's set in Sydney, I also needed to just sort of like make sure I captured those moments as I went along as well.
So one of the biggest mistakes that many journalists who write a book because of this nature make, and in fact many people make, is that a book is, 80,000 words, or it's a lot of words. Whereas a feature article could be 800 to 2,000 words on average. And journalists are often so used to writing short things, and they think, and again, let me just emphasize, I shouldn't just say journalists, many people think they just can write a series of articles that they can then slap together and voila, there is a book. But they soon realize that doesn't work in the vast majority of cases, because there's no narrative thread running through. And one of the fantastic things about the way you've written this is that you get to the end of a chapter and you plant the seed that makes me want to turn that page. And not only that, there is a narrative thread. Were you very clear on that at the start? Or did you also fall into that trap, maybe thinking you could write a series of articles and slap them together?
No, I wasn't clear on that from the start at all. This is my first book, so it was almost like learning. It was learning a completely new skill. I guess one of the things that did help me is that I, as a journalist, am a long form features writer. So I'll regularly write pieces for the Australian Women's Weekly that are 2,000-3,000 words long. So they're a bit longer than like an online word piece, for example. So and they're the pieces that I love writing the most. I always really like giving stories the oxygen to breathe that they deserve. But even with pieces like that, you are, as any writer, journalist would know, especially a features writer, you have to be stark, like absolutely. It's the George Orwell. Like if you can remove a word, it has to go, because all of my features are double the length that they should be. And then I'm like, damn, now I need to like just get down to the very stark bare bones of the story without losing any of the emotional connection or engagement or anything like that. It is a skill that you hone, and you become so brutally concise that you're right. When you write a book, you have to unlearn. You have to unlearn all of that and relearn a new way of writing. My publisher really helped me. My agent said something that was interesting. He said, journalists often write really bad books. And I thought, me. For the exact reasons that you've just described, that it can end up being quite brutally succinct and stark and just focused on the facts. And they're important, of course, but so is story. But I just think storytelling is hardwired within me, and that's why I was drawn to this world as well. Because when someone tells you about the experience they had with a psychic or a medium, the parts that I zone in on is, wow, you lost a sister when you were 15. That must have had a huge impact on your life. And they're more interested in like, but how would she have known that? How would this medium have known that? And I zone in on the humanity and the human stories, and I think that's the features writer within me. I don't think I did see it as a series of articles. I did see it as a stream of consciousness that unwound itself at its own pace. My initial first draft was 159 pages. That's too long. As you say, a book is 80,000. I think mine's about 77,000 words long now. So I think my publisher gulped quite robustly when they saw that. But they were fantastic in helping me restructure and condense. And the editing process is when your book comes to life and it becomes something perhaps even a bit more different than what you first imagined it would be, just slightly. And that was, although that was difficult for me, it was a bit like anything difficult. It's where I grew the most as a writer and as a professional, and where I really learned how to be a proper storyteller with, as you mentioned, a narrative thread that goes all the way through. I think their restructuring of it being the psychic tests with different tests in each chapter really, really helped, as I mentioned. Putting my sister in as the voice of the believer really helped. None of that was in the first draft. Um,
Oh, really? Your sister wasn't in the first draft?
She was in the first chapter of the first draft, but
Right.
my publisher was like, "Why don't you put her in almost every chapter?" So the believer has a voice. You know, when the reader
Yeah.
always comes back to the reader, and if the reader is the believer, or even has some kind of cognitive dissonance that means that they might sneakily, normally they keep it secret, believers. Everyone says they're a skeptic, they're not, so yeah, that worked really, really, and it was just something I'd never considered. So that's when the narrative thread started to become more apparent to me, and then I'd be able to sort of write more around that. And there were certain scenes, like for example, the scene when Naveen Rottinger comes into the court in chapter 2 or 3, and gives evidence about her role in the stockbroking firm that went bust. Like I remember my publisher saying, "Then why don't you?" You know, that was 2 lines, and my publisher said, "Take 5 pages and set the scene in the court as if it's a court drama. You've watched those, and then that was just brilliant, because I was like, fantastic." And then I could really, it gave it oxygen to breathe, of like me being able to sort of flex the muscle of my lexicon in a way that you can't always do in journalism. And so I really, really enjoyed that process, but it did have to be coaxed out of me, and I think that was part of that unlearning process.
What a great editor. um, no, so the other thing is that while your sister is a thread throughout the book, you are the other thread throughout the book. It's not a memoir, but you talk about very, very personal experiences and your beliefs and your, things that you've gone through that are difficult. And they are an integral part of this book, even though this book is, about psychics, right? It's also about you. Was it hard to, especially as, somebody who's usually an objective journalist, was it hard to lay your soul on the line a bit?
Yeah, it was. I mean, it's not hard to write those pieces because that comes naturally. It's just hard to know that the world's going to read that.
Well, yes, that's what I mean.
Yeah. Yeah, so yes, it was. Yeah, it was. I was able to go there, and I think not least because the psychics had drawn out of me some of the most intimate and vulnerable parts of my life. When you go and see a psychic, you're talking about very personal things, and your future and your romantic and professional future, and perhaps griefs that have happened to you that you've perhaps not even properly dealt with. So like, it almost becomes a form of counselling, and that's a raw area in itself. So they draw out of you things that you and bring up to the surface things that you may have buried. So it was there. I was able to go there, and I knew also from reading a lot of narrative nonfiction in preparation for writing this book. I knew that was in fashion, I guess, and what readers enjoy, and also when I've sort of read some of the reviews on Goodreads, it's really interesting because they're the bits that people have gone, "I wanted more of that," and I'm like, "More? Like I already love the whole there. What more do you want? How much more? How much more can I get?" So that was really, really interesting to me because they were the bits that were a bit uncomfortable, and to be honest with you, after writing them, although I got permissions and although I got consent, of course I did, I still feel like there's a cost. There's a cost to doing that, and the cost is worth it, but it is a cost. And I think any writer that's in this genre of narrative nonfiction needs to. I think that I was probably unprepared for that cost. This was my first book. Suddenly, my sister's name is all over the media. Our dad's death, all over the media, and we knew what we were signing up for. I knew I was writing it. She obviously signed off every word, but that is letting the world into the intimate, private life of my family. and
Mm.
that is a cost, and I am very protective over them, and I think that was sometimes difficult. And in the rollout, I don't think there was a lot of media on this book, and suddenly our faces were everywhere, and we're talking about the most fragile moments of our entire lives. Um, Maybe I wasn't quite. No one can really prepare you for that. So, and it occurred to me that that is exactly what I ask of my features, human interest features subjects to do, to share the most intimate part of their lives. So it, I've always been very protective over my sources as a journalist, but I think it made me even more aware of like the importance of
Mm.
follow up and empathy and checking in on mental health with people.
Mm.
So yeah, it was difficult, but it's really interesting to see that, because the bits that I enjoyed writing the most in the book were about Harry Houdini and Adolf Hitler's Jewish astrologer, and these just like I would spend days buried in research, and they were the bits that I absolutely loved writing the most, not the bits about my life. Because and then you also just kind of think, oh, I'm unimportant. Like I want to talk about other people's stories, not so much my own. But I realise that if I do a second book, it's what people want. So
Mm.
I just need to really think long and hard, and probably be a bit more prepared with me and myself and whoever that story affects and impacts in their lives, if that's something that I'm willing to do again.
So let's talk about your second book. Now that you've got the taste for it, no doubt you're obviously continuing with your journalism, but is there a second book in your brain?
Oh yeah, of course.
Oh, tell us
Well, I can't really
what you
tell you.
can.
The reason I can't tell you is because there's three narrative non-fiction subjects which I'm interested in. So I did a couple of courses for the Australian Writers' Centre, which, by the way, were fantastic and really helped me grow my confidence as a writer. So thank you for those. Ironically enough, they were in fiction, which I haven't gone on to write and publish. But although it's so different from narrative non-fiction, the storytelling element and the skills that I learnt there were still really invaluable for when I was putting together this book. And I did from those courses go away and write a fiction book. And then I wrote it. I won a place on a writer's residency, and I finished it. And then I put it in a drawer, and I gave it to my first readers, and I got that far, and I didn't at that point have an agent or anything like that. I then decided to go into narrative non-fiction because I'd been reading a lot of it and really loving it, and I just thought that's closer to journalism. Fiction is a whole different ballgame, and trying to make characters speak in dialogue that's actually believable and not stereotypical was finding was really, really difficult. So that fiction book is sat in my drawer, and I one day may be brave enough to then go back into it. But I do want my second book to be narrative non-fiction again. I have three subjects that I think would be really interesting, that may allow me to bring in a personal story, and also do the same of what I've done with this one, is go from the micro to the macro. But I don't. They're half baked, so I can't.
Okay.
I need to sort of like sit down with my friend over a bottle of red wine, who's also a writer, and just like hit them up. And then once I've done that, I'll come back to you and tell you which one I think. And then
I can't wait to hear. I can't wait to hear. All right. So, what was the most rewarding thing about writing this book, and what was the hardest thing?
the most rewarding thing, it brought me a lot closer to my sister.
Mm.
We're so different. I'm a skeptic. She's a believer. I'm a real storyteller and a talker. She's more of a listener. Um, we've always been very different growing up, and then just through writing the book, and getting inside her head, and seeing her perspective as a believer, and excuse me, stop laughing at her so much, and taking her more seriously, and meeting her where she's at. I think improved our bond and made us closer than we've ever been. Like, we talk on the phone now. She's in the UK. We never used to talk on the phone, and it brought me a lot closer, both to her, and also and she stepped into my world a bit. So she, having gone to obsessively see these 10 mediums to bring our deceased dad back into the room, she then listened to me and hired a grief counsellor, an accredited grief counsellor who's
Mm.
trained, unlike a lot of these mediums, who I think were, some of whom were charlatans.
Mm.
And she's never seen a medium since. So I think I stepped into her world, and she also stepped into mine, and we just started to hear each other more than we probably ever had done as brother and sister. So that was really rewarding. In addition to those people that I told you who would come and share, usually it was grief. Usually it was about a bereavement that they've suffered, that they
Mm.
don't. We just don't talk about those things much. It's a taboo that we create in society, and the knowing that I was writing a book about mediums and psychics gave them permission to come to me and to discuss that. And that was a real privilege to bear witness to their stories and their heartbreak and their journey through grief, through those 5 stages of grief, and through there's a 6th stage was recently added by the people who wrote the five
Mm.
stages of grief, which is called Finding Meaning, and that is exactly what this book is about. That is the crux of all of this. Whether anything paranormal exists or not is unimportant. It's finding meaning, and that's something that we really, really need to do as humans, even when something that happens is feels completely meaningless, like someone dying before their time. Is often one of the most meaningless things that can happen. And when people say everything happens for a reason, you come back to that and you think, what is that reason? And
Mm.
what I've learned is, through these people who obsessively go and see mediums, is that you need to sometimes find one and create one, even though it feels a bit perfunctory. So that was really rewarding, and I think I grew and matured a bit as a storyteller through their stories, and bearing witness to their stories in a way that was more empathetic than I had been as a hardened skeptic. The most challenging, it's writing a book is challenging because the industry was going through. The industry is hard enough as it is, and then I was in lockdown for half of the writing of the book, and I wrote most of the book from the State Library of New South Wales, which is like my home from home, and where I really just focused. And then when that got taken away from me, it was really hard to sit in my bedroom where I sleep every day, and I don't have enough money for a house big enough for an office. So I would roll out of bed, and 2 meters from my bed is my desk, and there was no separation, and so doing that in lockdown was a real challenge. And then the libraries reopened, and then I just was on a roll. And then when we were releasing the book, there was a huge media uptake and interest, but we were in lockdown. So one of the really hard things that happened was, we had this really big win when Big W bought thousands of the books, and apparently that's relatively rare for a first-time author like me. So that was a huge win, and then we went back into the really long, strict lockdown in Sydney, and then there was hardly any Big Ws open in the country. Like in the
Mm.
2 biggest cities in Australia, every Big W and every Dimmicks was closed. So by the time 5 months later, when we reopened, my book stood no chance really. It was just buried, and didn't really get the placement on the shelves that it could have done if we weren't in lockdown, and that really impacted sales. I didn't get to, my publisher had planned in launch events for me in Melbourne, Brisbane, and Sydney. They all went, venues booked in, everything. So that all went over
Mm.
through Zoom. So I guess like writing your first book is a really special moment that you don't get back. And I think this is partly why I want to do a second book, because I still haven't even been able to get together with my friends and just have a drink and celebrate the
Mm.
fact that I
Mm.
spent 2 years doing that. So I think as a debut author, all that stuff was a challenge. But I met I met those challenges, and I got the book out, and there was a great media on it, and it's a real joy to do podcasts like this with you and to talk about it. So I'm really grateful for all those things.
Well, it's a fantastic book. Finally, what's your top 3 tips for aspiring writers who want to write their own, creative nonfiction book one day?
Uh, do a course at the Australian Writers Centre. You haven't told me to say that, but do, because I had a form of imposter syndrome before I went there. Even now, I feel uncomfortable saying I'm an author. It just sounds pretentious to me. I don't know if that's because of my background or my accent, or I don't know. But the imposter syndrome of saying I am a published writer now, like I feel uncomfortable and it makes me sweat. But doing those courses gave me the confidence to believe that one day I would be, and that I would have the dogged determination to get there. So those courses will also get you in touch with your creative side, because you'll be alongside peers who are also creative, and it gives you permission to think and talk creatively, which we don't always do in our lives. So that's number one. Number two, get an agent. So before you go to a publisher, it's probably a bit easier to get an agent. And so I didn't know that about the industry, and I actually found out through one of your courses that was a good route. It's not the only route, but I always thought you just pitch to publishing houses. You don't. You pitch yourself to an agent first, and then once an agent takes you on, they take you on that journey with them. And number three, like I would say, one of the things I've learned is that your first draft is just telling the story to yourself, and you can get caught up in it being perfect. So don't let being good and being perfect be the enemy of actually getting it done, because creation happens in the redraft and the edit, but your first act of creation is your first draft. So you don't even need an agent to do your first draft. You don't need to have done a course to do your first draft. Just start writing and stop getting in the way of yourself, and get out of the way of your own brain, and try and get into flow a little bit. Find a place. Like my place is the library of New South Wales. It's beautiful. Once you get somewhere like that and you get into flow, even if you're not going to use your first 3 chapters at all, usually your chapter 4 ends up becoming your chapter 1, and you discard those first 3 chapters. You would have always had to have written those 3 chapters to get to that perfect start of your story. So it's that process of unlearning all of the things that we do in emails and in journalist articles and in life, which is to be to the point and brief and concise. And it's allowing yourself to flow in a stream of consciousness way, that will nourish your creative side, and you'll probably surprise yourself about the things that come out when you give yourself the space and the time to do that. So find the space and find the time, and let yourself know that you deserve it.
What great advice. Thank you so much, Gary. So Gary's book, The Psychic Test, An Adventure in the World of Believers and Sceptics. I could not put the book down. It's just so well written, so well researched, so interesting and utterly fascinating. So thank you so much for your time today, Gary, and congratulations on the book.
Absolute pleasure.